Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Welcome to the Urban Agenda. New York State's minimum wage stands at $5.15 an hour, the federal minimum, and has been at that rate since 1997. A new campaign has been launched by a coalition of organizations, including the Community Service Society, to increase the minimum wage in New York State to $7.10 an hour by 2006. This issue is now being considered by the state legislature. My guests today are Mark Alesse, the New York State Director of the National Federation of Independent Businesses, representing small and independent businesses throughout the nation, and Paul Sonn, Associate Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. Welcome to you both to the Urban Agenda.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Now, before we get into this topic, which has some different points of view, why don't you explain your different organizations? Paul, would you start? And what is the Brennan Center?
Sure. The Brennan Center is a public policy center at NYU Law School. We work with state and local government and community groups around the country on new policies to reform government and help working families. We do a lot of work around campaign finance reform, criminal justice policy, and in particular around minimum wage. We work with state and local governments, helping them design minimum wage legislation.
Mark?
Yes, NFIB is the nation's largest small business advocacy organization. We've got 20,000 small business members in New York, 600,000 nationwide, and we represent Main Street businesses, typically businesses with about 10 employees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why do you both, and I'll start with you, Paul, why do you think this is suddenly, 1997 was the last activity in the state of New York on minimum wage. Suddenly, almost every day, the Daily News just did a series of articles. They've come out with an editorial seeking the increase in the minimum wage. The legislature is now almost having a bidding war between the Republican Guy Villela and the Assembly on now it's time to increase the minimum wage. Why now?
I think it's just increasing recognition of the inadequacy of the $5.15 minimum wage. I mean, that's really the core problem here. And just like the audience to pause for a moment and think really what that means in human terms. You know, living at $5.15 an hour, it's $206 a week, a little more than $900 a month, $10,000 a year. And even if you're in an inexpensive upstate county, I mean, it just doesn't take a PhD economist to show that that really is just nowhere near enough for even a single working person to get by, let alone someone supporting anyone.
Now, Mark, your organization has been strongly opposed. Why do you think is going on at this point? Why suddenly this is coming to the fore? And what's your take on it from your vantage point?
Well, it seems to us that the impetus behind this are the big labor in New York and the nation. The AFL-CIO, the Working Families Party, which are closely allied to big labor, are interested in increasing the minimum wage because they know that puts upward pressure across the entire wage scale. That wage inflation might seem, on first blush, to be a beneficial thing for workers and working families, but it won't be. It'll actually be counterproductive. It'll actually inflate. When you inflate wages, you also have to have a response to that. And the response to that won't be good for low-skill, entry-level workers, and it won't be good for low-wage earning families. At the very least, people are going to be put out of work, or you're going to inflate prices such that you'll mitigate the effects of the increase in the minimum wage, and it'll do no good at all. The advocates for the increase in the minimum wage are saying that you can't live on $5.15 an hour and head a household. And to that we say, we agree, you can't. But in a state like New York, you've got a whole panoply of support services that are provided by the government that substantially increases the effective minimum wage.
But doesn't that raise a question? Aren't we just cost shifting here? Aren't we putting, this is going to end up in more taxes for individuals out there? If we cost shift and make the public pay for what private sector should be paying for, isn't that the wrong way to shift the costs here?
You have to look at these jobs as entry-level, low-skill, rudimentary jobs. They don't really command a higher wage. We can't price salaries based on people's needs. We have to price salaries based on the skills that they bring to the marketplace.
If I could jump in, Mark said a whole bunch of things, and many of them, unfortunately, just aren't accurate. On the entry-level jobs, research shows a very substantial part of the population spends their whole careers in these jobs that pay less than $12 an hour, cycling through these home health care worker jobs, child care jobs, retail jobs. They're not these stepping stones, and that's why we should be concerned about it. There are a lot of, the research shows that people earning these wages are adults. They're not teenagers.
Less than $12 an hour.
These are people we should care about.
Okay.
The other stuff Mark has been saying, the claims about job losses, that's really, it's time to put that economic folklore to rest. That's what people used to think 20 years ago, but the consistent research over state and federal minimum wage hikes since then has shown no significant job losses. Even the President's Council of Economic Advisors agrees. So it's time to kind of put that to rest and focus on the real issues, that this is an important working people issue, and 515 just isn't enough.
Mark?
Well, I noticed that he said that people are stuck in jobs at under $12 an hour. That's a long way from the $5.15 of the minimum wage. Whenever we've had public hearings on this subject in Albany and other state capitals, the advocates bring low-wage workers out to talk about what it's like to earn a living making the minimum wage. But you know what? They never bring anyone up there who's earning the minimum wage.
Well, but the Daily News was the one that just reported that they think 700,000 people are now at the minimum wage.
But they're mostly teenagers.
No, actually, right here, 74% adults, in fact. This is the report the Fiscal Policy Institute put out last week. Of the 691,000 making less than $7 an hour, 74% adults.
I think the trouble is in New York City, so many of our youth are completely unemployed that these are low-wage workers now. They've been sort of shoved into it.
Yeah, and if you increase the price of something, what naturally happens is you get less of it. If you increase the cost of labor, you're going to have less labor. If you take a small business with 10 employees earning the minimum wage, and you increase the minimum wage by $1.60 an hour, okay, that nets out to $32,000 in additional payroll costs, just payroll costs to the small businessmen. Now, many small businesses today, the owner is earning $30,000 a year. Where is he going to get an additional $30,000 for the payroll hike, plus the increase in Social Security taxes, workers' comp insurance, unemployment taxes? It's not just payroll. But that is just a small business employing 10 people at the minimum wage. You're asking him to suddenly just come up with $32,000 a year. It's not there.
Well, let's talk, Mark, Paul, specifically about the issue of small businesses. Can they sustain this?
Absolutely. This is the same noise you hear from the low-wage employers every time the state or federal minimum wage is increased. Every time it's been increased, the job losses they've claimed just haven't materialized. There's just no data to support it. And if you think through, then you think, how does a small business owner respond to this? Well, the reality is that better paid workers are better workers, and there are savings for businesses. Think of it, if you bump your workers' pay up from $5.15 to $7, folks stay on the job longer, there's less turnover, they can be trained up, they're better motivated, and these translate into better productivity and countervailing savings for employers. And the lesson of the last 20 years is...
Mark, just to be the devil's advocate, would you support the advocates in a minimum wage for larger employers above the minimums you're setting here?
No, I think the minimum wage actually destroys jobs and opportunity for
So this is blanket. This is across Walmart and the small business, the mom and pop store should be treated the same in terms of minimum wage.
I don't know that Walmart pays anyone at the minimum wage. And in fact, I don't know anyone that is paying the minimum wage. I'm just suggesting to you that when you raise the minimum wage, you put upward pressure across the entire wage structure.
Is there a question whether we should have a minimum wage at all under that thesis? Paul?
Theoretically, there is that question. I mean, years ago when the minimum wage was enacted,
this is something the
minimum wage didn't apply to retail jobs. It applied only to mining, manufacturing, and transportation, the real heavy-duty kinds of employment. But, the key thing here to remember is that it's not necessary, because of the supplementary programs that we have to supplement the income of low-wage workers. We have the Earned Income Tax Credit, a Child Independent Care Credit. We have food stamps. We have a Home Energy Assistance Program, a real property tax circuit breaker. We have Healthy New York, Family New York, and Medicaid.
But the trouble is Medicaid is driving small counties under. You're saying that basically small businesses should have the priority in the taxation system.
And the fact
that essentially you should shove these costs onto the federal government and the taxpayers rather than small business. How can we just say that?
I'm saying if you want to protect their jobs, you'd better socialize the costs of low-wage workers in this fashion.
That sounds more
Share the
radical
costs.
than me.
No, well, the suggestion here is that if you put the cost on a small business that doesn't have the profits to pay for it, they're going to either cut jobs, or what happens is, as you increase the minimum wage, higher skilled teens become attracted back into the workforce, and they come in. So there isn't necessarily a job loss situation, except for the low skill person that has the job. He'll be substituted for by a higher skilled teenager who comes into the market now because he's more interested in working at $7 an hour.
Paul?
There's just so many points that just aren't accurate. First, these benefits, the earned income tax credit's an important policy, but it's not enough. It should be expanded, but the minimum wage increase that we're talking about would leave every worker affected better off, substantially better off. The earned income tax credit just is not enough. And these claims of job losses, they really haven't been borne out. The reality is actually small businesses are sympathetic, but in fact they are not disproportionately affected by these minimum wage increases. The real concentrations of low-wage workers are in the large firms. They actually are affected most, and in fact, and they can bear the cost. And the suggestions that you'll be hurting the workers you're trying to help. I'd like Mark to kind of show me a minimum wage worker in New York who says, "Don't do this to me. Please don't give me the raise. I'd rather work at $5.15." And the reality is, of course, he can't find one, and that's because everyone is better off from a minimum wage hike.
I'm wondering, Mark, if there's some other way to subsidize small employers rather than taking it out of their workforce. I'm very interested in small employers. I think they're the engine in many poor communities we work in. The question becomes, is driving their workers who have to pay as much as $800 a month just on rent, how are they going to do this? It doesn't sound like we're taking it out. If we're already talking about a socialized, as you used, support system for low-wage workers, shouldn't we have a better way of distribution than coming up with driving their wages down or keeping their wages down artificially?
We're not keeping their wages down artificially. 6 months into the job, after you've learned the skills of the job, you learn to come to work on time and be prepared and work the register properly. People get raises. They don't just stay.
Well, they are down
Okay,
artificially. If the minimum wage kept pace with inflation in New York, it would be $8.83 today. Instead, it's $5.15. 12 other states have minimum wages higher. Connecticut's at $7.10. This isn't anything new. This is just keeping up with what other reasonable states do.
Okay. We'll be right back to continue the Urban Agenda.
The itsy bitsy spider went up the went up the.
Get proper nutrition before it's too late.
I forget.
Call or visit WIC. WIC provides nutrition information, healthcare referrals, even food. Your child has you, and you have WIC.
We're talking about raising the state minimum wage in New York from the current federal minimum of $5.15 to $7.10. Joining us are Mark Alesse of the National Federation of Independent Business and Paul Sonn, Associate Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. Mark, a number of other states have gone ahead and raised the minimum wage. Does your organization see signs of slowdown in their economy or immediate injury to their small businesses?
We haven't done any studies of that sort to be able to identify that as such. But we do know that one of the principal motivations behind doing an increase in minimum wage is to raise wages across the entire wage structure. I mean, that's why big labor is behind it. Big labor does not employ workers who earn the minimum wage, so why would they be after an increase in the minimum wage? This year was the first year that the Working Families Party actually explicitly stated that they wanted that impact, that wage inflation bump up across the wage structure. They feel that's a goal that they should be shooting for. We feel that would be economically destructive to the entire economy and the business climate of New York State. Right now, New York has one of the worst business climates in the nation. We're one of the highest tax states in the country. And we have the highest indebtedness in the country. we have problems here in our business climate and in our economy. Now to artificially add wage inflation to the mix could only do damage. And, you know, we were talking earlier about the other programs that subsidize the minimum wage, and I think it's very important to consider that NFIB and other business groups have always supported increases in the earned income tax credit, because we feel that subsidizing low-wage workers in this fashion doesn't hurt the business and doesn't hurt the job opportunities of low-wage, low-skill, entry-level workers. And if you have a family with 2 or more children earning the minimum wage, and they get the earned income tax credit and food stamps and school meals and health insurance, that comes to a total of over $30,000 a year, or an average of $14.75 an hour. Okay. That's a substantial bump up in their income.
Well,
Paul,
Mark,
your response.
We're all with you on the earned income tax credit, but the thing is, it's a good program, but it's one the taxpayers pay for, and you have to fund it. So if you join us in proposing to close some business tax loopholes to pay for expanding the earned income tax credit, we'd support it. But surprisingly, you know, business has not been there at the table when these things have been suggested. Now, it's really telling to look at these other states. A dozen other states, neighboring Connecticut, you know, every Walmart there, every McDonald's there pays $7, $10 an hour. The sky hasn't fallen. The economy works fine. New York itself used to have a higher minimum wage. There's, you know, the sort of effects that Mr. Alesse is talking about really have not been borne out. And in fact, the politics here, it's not labor politics, because, you know, as Mark said, actually, New York's, you know, union workers are, you know, well paid, will not be affected at all. It's actually the reality that millions of low-income, 700,000 low-income, mostly people of color New Yorkers, another 500,000 making a little bit more than the minimum wage, are struggling to get by, would be helped by this proposal, and the people of New York support it. The polling consistently shows the people want this. And then you ask, why is Albany not responding? And, you know, some people think the fact that your organization is one of the largest donors in Albany may actually have...
Well, that's not... Okay.
That's not true.
No, moreover, it's not relevant here.
It's not relevant,
But
and it's not
let me
true.
get into the other issue, though. I sit on the State Senate's task force on Medicaid, which is really becoming the central issue in the state, in addition perhaps to minimum wage. And clearly, the problem is, and the growing problem is that they're finding many people who are fully employed can't afford basic health insurance and are being dumped back into the public system and driving the counties to the wall. So the cost shifting that goes on here does have consequences that ultimately may not be politically be borne either by, you know, the legislature or the businesses. There's a problem developing here where we can't just suddenly say that businesses can maintain low levels of pay and not expect the taxpayers to ultimately saying we can't do this either.
Exactly right, David.
And
it's
I'm wondering how we come to some consensus here. I'm not looking for the perfect world here.
Yeah.
But clearly, as I talk to people from the upstate counties on Medicaid, they can't spend anymore.
No,
and they're talking about closing off Medicaid, particularly to low-wage workers who are in this marginal area.
Well, I don't think anyone's going to be able to shut down the Medicaid program, but what we are going to possibly have to do is reduce some of the optional benefits that New York has opted into, which we have more of than almost any other state in the country. Furthermore, we've got a structure of Medicaid in New York that forces the local governments to pay 25% of the Medicaid costs, which, as you know, no other state does. So we've got some unique structural problems in Medicaid that make it a real problem, and they have to be addressed. And I'm glad to hear that you're on that task force, because they've made some good recommendations.
Well, we should, but David's exactly right. Basically, by dropping the minimum wage, we've allowed low-wage employers to be subsidized by the taxpayers. And in fact, it's hurting good employers. Employers that want to pay $7, $8 an hour can't do it because they're being undercut by their minimum wage competitors. So raising the minimum wage is a way to help, you know, all employers compete on a fair playing field and not shift off the costs of their employment to the taxpayers.
The difficulty clearly also is the expenses in New York make this a somewhat unique situation. I mean, with housing costs taking well over 50% of the income of just poor people, not to mention low-wage workers, there's a cost escalation that's going up in one sector, housing, food, basic supports, and the notion of keeping it capped in another seems a little weird.
If you want to artificially inflate the wage above the skill level that the worker brings to the workplace, you're going to deny that worker opportunities. The businessman is rational. You can't mandate him
This sounds
to
a
be...
little like Malthus.
Well,
I mean,
the
if they can't
dynamic is
do
actually
it,
the
they
worst.
die.
Let me finish. If the businessman's rationally looking at an employee who doesn't bring to the table $8, $9 an hour worth of service and value in the workplace, he's not going to pay that person that kind of money. He's going to substitute him with another more skilled person, or he's going to ask his managers to pick up the slack and let him go. There's just a limit. These are entry-level jobs. These are not careers. Once you've learned the skills of the workplace and learned to come to work on time and learned the skills required to do the job, you're given an increase. And on average, that happens at 6 months on the job.
You need to do a reality check and think of these jobs. These are janitors' jobs. They're child care jobs. They're home health care jobs. They're retail worker jobs. There are not legions of highly skilled workers that are going to leap in and take these jobs when you bump the pay to $7 an hour. And the research has borne this out. When you raise the pay, in fact, it incents the employers to invest in training, to keep the workers on the job. There's lower turnover. There's better productivity. It really encourages a high
How do we change
productivity model.
where we're going here? Sure. Say we do get an increase in the minimum wage. Sure. What would you want from a small business perspective to make it easier for people to operate? Say the consensus bills, the Daily News is followed by the New York Post. You know, who knows that the New York Times, obviously Newsday, all come out, and Guy Villela gets all the Republican senators to come out, and it's done. What then would your small businesses be looking for in terms of supports to make it possible in that new reality? Obviously, there was a bump before, and there had to be a readjustment in 1997. I mean, this is clearly what you're against at this point, but we're all obviously realist in terms of we play the cards we get.
Yeah.
But what in that context would small business be demanding?
I'm trying to rack my brains to think about it, but the only thing that comes to mind is a tax cut. Cut their taxes so they can afford to.
Well,
to
would this be across the board tax cuts or for small businesses particularly? Because this is an area where I think we've been interested. I served on the Empowerment Zone Board in Central Harlem. There's a question of whether small businesses that are struggling in an economically deprived area should be getting some support from the government directly so they can continue to hire people and provide a decent wage.
And I think that would be a wonderful way of dealing with it.
Would organizations like yours be, the rural areas, obviously, in parts of New York State, anyone who drives through knows.
Sure, they face many of the same problems.
And some of these towns need it.
Struggling, there's no
But
question
wouldn't that
about
be
it.
a more a rational way to target to where the help is needed desperately, that doesn't necessarily end up, crippling either the small employer or the wage earner?
I'd have to actually think it through. I think it would be as good as the Earned Income Tax Credit and the other programs to supplement the wages. It's also a subsidization, though, of the business. It also comes out of the tax base. I don't
But it's
see
so
where
clear that we do that in developing parts of the world. We provide all sorts of incentives. Why not for small businesses, the little cleaners in my own Bedford-Stuyvesant, or an upstate community where the town is imploding because, Kodak has lost. Sure. I mean, those, little grocery stores, I would support providing incentives to those guys.
Yeah, I'm not going to take exception to that. I think that would be a fine idea, but I don't think it's really fundamentally different than providing the incentive to the worker. Because if you go to the worker with the benefits, you say to him, if you work, if you're supporting a household, if you're supporting your family in a job, we will give you these tax subsidies.
Paul?
It's the progressive tax reform is badly needed in New York State. I think linking it to the minimum wage hike probably is not the right approach, with the exception of perhaps for distressed, sort of struggling areas where a comprehensive economic
which in New York State is
most of upstate.
No, that's true. But New York should be investing in encouraging the development of high-wage jobs and not subsidizing minimum-wage, low-wage employers. Though there's no shortage of minimum-wage jobs. Sadly, over the last 30 years, they've ballooned to the point that now, a quarter of all jobs in our economy are paid barely more than minimum wage. That's the problem, and we don't want to encourage it. The solution is to raise the minimum wage, it's to expand access to government-subsidized health care, it's to raise the Earned Income Tax Credit, and to invest in skills-building programs. But the minimum wage is a crucial part of it. Another key element is most of these other things cost a lot of money. We're in a tough fiscal situation in New York, and the minimum wage is one of the smart things you can do for working people that doesn't cost the state money, and we need to do it.
It's interesting. We don't hear much alliances working out. There are clearly going to be differences between the advocates for the poor and small business and lobbying groups, but there isn't much cross-discussion going on. And I find that across the state. I mean, I recognize, having driven parts of this state, that small businesses in some of the towns that have lost, core employers are just a disaster. They're a disaster, in terms of the access to jobs for, kids coming out of the local schools, and they're a disaster for these families who have been working on businesses, mainly, mom and pop businesses for a long time. But there is very little discussion across, sort of interest groups here.
Well, I wouldn't want to characterize it quite so starkly. We have consistently supported increase in the earned income tax credit. Again, because I think that approach doesn't hurt small businesses and it doesn't hurt the low-wage worker. We're really not interested in denying low-wage, entry-level workers opportunities.
Would you
Paul,
support a
just a
tax
short-
increase to fund it, Mark? Because the money doesn't come out of nowhere. We have a deficit.
I'm glad to see that you understand that money doesn't come out of nowhere.
That's right.
Well, on that note, my thanks to Mark Alesse of the National Federation of Independent Business and Paul Sonn of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society, and thank you for watching The Urban Agenda. To learn more about the work of the Community Service Society of New York or to comment on the Urban Agenda, please contact us at 212-614-5425 and on the web at www.cssny.org.